The air in the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited was thick with the scent of dried lavender and something else, something faintly metallic like old pennies. I'd never known her, my grandmother. She'd been a ghost in family lore, a woman of quiet strength who'd apparently left this place to my mother, who in turn had left it to me. It was a relic, a time capsule of a life I couldn't quite grasp, filled with knick-knacks and faded photographs. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon sun that slanted through the grimy window panes. It was a far cry from the sterile hum of the observatory, the cold, calculated precision of numbers on a screen. I ran a hand over the rough, unvarnished wood of the kitchen table. My fingers traced the faint rings left by forgotten mugs, the scars of a life lived. It felt wrong, this stillness. My world was one of constant motion, of celestial bodies hurtling through the void, of equations that attempted to map the infinite. Here, time seemed to have settled like the dust into a quiet, undisturbed layer. It had been 6 months since Sarah. The universe, once my obsession, now felt like a cruel, indifferent expanse. I'd retreated, seeking solace not in the familiar comfort of my work, but in the unfamiliar quiet of this inherited solitude. I'd packed a few boxes of essentials, mostly books, and driven until the city lights were a distant smear. Then a memory. My mother had mentioned the farmhouse once, a throwaway line about inheriting it. I'd never visited. The village itself was a cluster of weathered stone buildings huddled against a perpetual mist, a place that seemed to exist outside the usual flow of time. The locals, when I'd encountered them at the single general store, offered polite, vacant nods. They were like the furniture here, part of the landscape, undisturbed by my presence. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Perhaps just a place to breathe, to let the suffocating weight of grief press down without the constant reminders of what I'd lost. Sarah had loved the stars. We'd spent countless nights on our balcony, her head on my shoulder, tracing constellations, her voice a soft murmur against my ear as she invented stories for the patterns. My days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the creak of the old house. I'd wake with the first pale light, make weak coffee, and sit by the window watching the mist curl around the ancient oak in the yard. I'd read, the words blurring into abstract shapes on the page, my mind a restless tide, always pulling back to her. One afternoon, while rummaging through a dusty attic trunk filled with moth-eaten linens and brittle letters, my fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. It was a small wooden box, inlaid with a tarnished brass clasp. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a single, tarnished silver locket. It was intricately engraved, not with initials but with a swirling, geometric pattern that seemed to shift and rearrange itself the longer I looked at it. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth emanated from it, a subtle vibration that hummed against my fingertips. I opened the locket. Inside, instead of a photograph, was a tiny, folded piece of paper, brittle with age. Carefully, I unfolded it. It wasn't a message, not in any language I recognized. It was a series of symbols, stark and angular, arranged in a precise, almost mathematical sequence. They were alien, yet disturbingly familiar, like a forgotten dream trying to surface. A prickle of unease, sharp and unexpected, crawled up my spine. I couldn't shake the image of those symbols. I found myself sketching them in a worn notebook, trying to decipher their meaning. My astrophysicist's mind instinctively seeking a pattern, a logic. The familiar comfort of scientific inquiry began to stir within me, a faint ember glowing in the ashes of my grief. I took out my laptop, the screen a harsh rectangle of light in the dim room. I had a secure connection, a habit from my work, a need to keep a part of that world close, even in my retreat. I began to search, running algorithms on the symbols, cross-referencing them with known astronomical phenomena, with ancient scripts, with anything that might offer a clue. Hours blurred. The wind outside intensified, rattling the window panes with an insistent, almost demanding rhythm. Then, buried deep within a dormant archive, a file I'd forgotten I'd even downloaded, something flickered. It was raw data, a series of unusual spectral readings from a distant, unremarkable nebula. I dismissed it as an anomaly, a sensor glitch, a cosmic hiccup. But as I ran my analysis comparing the spectral lines to the patterns on the paper, a terrifying coherence began to emerge. The symbols weren't random. They were a signature, a call, or perhaps a warning. The locket lay on the table, its intricate design seeming to pulse with a faint internal light, a vast, ancient intelligence. Was it truly out there, waiting? And if so, what did it want with me? The dust motes danced in the shafts of light slicing through the grimy panes of the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited. Each particle seemed to carry its own faint luminescence, a miniature cosmos swirling in the stagnant air. I ran a finger along the rough-hewn wood of the mantelpiece, the grain a miniature topographical map of forgotten time. The metallic tang, sharp and persistent, still pricked at my nostrils. It was the smell of absence, of a life lived and then abruptly extinguished, leaving only echoes and this peculiar coppery scent. I had come here to this remote pocket of the world seeking. I wasn't entirely sure. Solace, answers, perhaps just a change of scenery from the sterile confines of my observatory, a place that had become too saturated with the ghosts of my own grief. My wife, Alina, had loved the stars. We'd spent countless nights on the roof, tracing constellations, her laughter a bright counterpoint to the silent expanse. Now the silence was all that remained, vast and crushing. The data, that was the real reason. A flicker, a ghost in the machine, a whisper of something that shouldn't be there. I dismissed it at first, a calibration error, a stray cosmic ray. But it had persisted, a persistent anomaly in the otherwise predictable hum of the universe. It was too patterned, too deliberate to be random. It felt intentional. And that was the thought that had gnawed at me, driving me to this forgotten corner of the countryside. I sat at the heavy oak table, the same one where my grandmother, a woman I knew only through faded photographs and hushed family stories, must have prepared meals or perhaps just sat, contemplating the quiet life that unfolded around her. My laptop, a stark contrast to the antique surroundings, lay open, its screen a beacon of modern intrusion. The data stream scrolled, lines of numbers and graphs representing the silent language of the cosmos. It was beautiful in its own way, orderly, predictable, until it wasn't. Then it happened. A low hum, barely perceptible at first, began to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the ancient house settling. This was a deeper resonance, a frequency that seemed to originate not from the earth, but from somewhere far, far beyond. The air grew heavy, the scent of lavender and metal intensifying, becoming almost suffocating. My breath hitched. My hands, usually steady, trembled as I reached for my coffee mug. The ceramic felt cold, impossibly so, against my fingertips. The laptop screen flickered. Not a power surge, but a deliberate, rhythmic pulse. The data streams, moments before a steady flow, began to warp. They twisted and contorted, the familiar patterns dissolving into something alien and incomprehensible. Lines of code, usually so precise, seemed to writhe like living things. I stared, my mind struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. It was like watching a familiar language suddenly spoken in a tongue of pure, unadulterated chaos. The hum deepened, a guttural thrum that resonated in my bones. It felt like the world was holding its breath. The dust motes, which had been dancing, now hung suspended, frozen in their descent. A profound stillness fell over the room, broken only by that maddening internal vibration. I could feel a prickling sensation on my skin, as if countless tiny needles were being pressed into my flesh. I looked up from the screen, my gaze drawn to the window. The afternoon light, which had been so clear, was now diffused, as if a vast, unseen veil had been drawn across the sky. The familiar shapes of trees outside seemed to blur, their edges softening, their forms subtly shifting. It was a visual distortion, a trick of the light, I told myself. The data on the screen coalesced, forming a single, stark symbol. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, a complex geometric pattern that seemed to defy Euclidean space. It pulsed with a faint internal light, a sickly, phosphorescent green. And as I watched, mesmerized and terrified, the symbol began to expand, filling the screen, pushing back the familiar lines of code, consuming the last vestiges of order. The metallic scent was overwhelming now, acrid and sharp like ozone after a lightning strike. My mouth felt dry, my tongue thick and useless. I wanted to stand, to run, to escape this suffocating presence, but my limbs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. The hum intensified, becoming a deafening roar that seemed to emanate from the very air around me. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force pressing in on me, threatening to crush me. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the roar cut off, the hum ceased. The dust motes resumed their slow descent. The light outside seemed to normalize, the trees regaining their familiar solidity. The silence was now more terrifying than the noise. The metallic tang lingered, a phantom scent in the air. The symbol burned into my retinas, still pulsed behind my closed eyelids. It had been real, undeniable. The anomaly had not just reappeared, it had announced itself, and it had done so with a power that shook the foundations of my understanding. What had I just witnessed? And more importantly, what had witnessed me? The air in the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited hung heavy, thick with the scent of dust and something else. Something dry and vegetal like forgotten potpourri. It clung to the back of my throat. I traced the carved patterns on the mantelpiece, the wood worn smooth by generations of hands. My own hands, usually steady, felt clumsy, alien. The data I'd brought with me, loaded onto a battered laptop, felt like a profane intrusion in this quiet, faded place. I'd come here seeking refuge, a temporary escape from the sterile hum of the observatory, from the phantom weight of my wife beside me in our empty bed. But the anomaly, this whisper in the cosmic static, had followed me. It was a persistent itch beneath my skin, a question I couldn't unask. The laptop screen cast a pale blue rectangle onto the dim room. I'd spent hours yesterday, poring over the raw spectral lines, the gravitational wave signatures. They were elegant, impossibly so. Not the chaotic symphony of a dying star or the predictable rhythm of a binary system. This was deliberate. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I'd isolated a particular cluster of readings, a faint resonance that appeared only in the deepest regions of space, far from any known celestial bodies. It was a pattern that shouldn't exist, like finding a perfect geometric shape etched into a random smear of paint. I ran the comparison algorithms again. The same result. A statistical anomaly so profound it bordered on the impossible. My breath hitched. I leaned closer, the stale air filling my lungs. The numbers swam before my eyes, but the conclusion remained stark, immutable. This wasn't natural. A sudden creak from the floorboards above made me jump. My head snapped up. The farmhouse was old, settling, I told myself. Just the wood groaning under its own weight, but the sound had been sharp, distinct. A footstep. I forced myself to breathe, to focus. The anomaly, I had to understand it. I began cross-referencing the resonance with known astrophysical phenomena. Pulsars, quasars, black hole mergers, nothing matched. The signature was too clean, too ordered. It was like listening to a single, pure note in the midst of a cosmic roar. I pulled up the telemetry from the older, deep space probes, the ones that had ventured beyond the heliosphere decades ago. Their data was sparse, grainy, but there. And then, buried within a decades-old data packet from Voyager 3, I found it. A faint echo, a ghost of the same resonance. It had been there all along, dismissed as instrument error, as background noise. But it wasn't noise. It was a signal. My heart began to thrum, not with excitement, but with a growing unease. A cold, creeping dread that had nothing to do with the chill of the old farmhouse. This entity, whatever it was, had been broadcasting its existence for a long time. And it wasn't just broadcasting. I started mapping the occurrences, plotting the points in three-dimensional space. They weren't random. They formed a shape, an intricate, sprawling lattice that seemed to encompass entire galaxies. It was like a blueprint, or a net. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes. The thin glass shivered. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long, distorted shadows across the overgrown garden. The light seemed to dim faster than it should. I zoomed in on a particular nexus point in the data, a place where the resonance was strongest. But the data insisted. Something was there. Something that pulsed with this impossible order. And then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible drift in the gravitational constant at that nexus. A subtle warping of space-time that wasn't accounted for by any known mass. It was minuscule, but it was there. This entity wasn't just broadcasting, it was acting. It was subtly, deliberately bending the fabric of the universe. My hands trembled. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, as if unseen eyes were watching me from the corners of the room. The dust motes, catching the fading light, no longer seemed like innocent particles. They seemed like tiny, indifferent witnesses to something vast and terrible. I looked at the laptop screen, at the intricate web of data spread across it. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. A testament to an intelligence so far beyond our own that it made our understanding of the cosmos seem like a child's scribbles. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an unveiling. And the thing being unveiled was not benevolent. A floorboard upstairs groaned again, louder this time. Then a soft thud. My breath caught in my chest. I was alone in this house. I was sure of it, but the sounds persisted, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to mock my solitude. I pushed my chair back, the scraping sound unnaturally loud. I could feel it on my exposed skin, a tangible drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the setting sun. What was that sound? And why did it feel like it was getting closer? The dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that pierced the gloom of the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited. It was a light so thin, so fragile, it seemed to be struggling against the encroaching shadows. I ran my fingers over the worn wood again, the geometric patterns alien to my touch. They weren't purely decorative. There was a rhythm to them, a subtle, repeating sequence that tickled at the edge of my memory, like a forgotten equation. My breath hitched. I moved deeper into the room, my footsteps muffled by the threadbare rug. The silence here was not peaceful. On a small inlaid table, a book lay open. Its binding was cracked, the pages brittle and yellowed. The script within was unlike anything I had ever seen, not Latin, not Greek, not Cyrillic. It was a series of intricate glyphs, sharp angles and flowing curves interwoven, forming patterns that mirrored those on the mantelpiece. My heart began a slow, deliberate thudding against my ribs. The glyphs continued, but here, interspersed with them, were crude drawings. They depicted celestial bodies, swirling nebulae, and what looked unmistakably like star charts. But the constellations were wrong, the arrangements alien. And then I saw it. A recurring symbol, a knot of interlocking spirals that appeared next to certain star clusters. It was the same symbol I had found etched into the data fragment from the observatory, the one that had sent me spiraling down this rabbit hole. My hands trembled as I traced the symbol on the page. This wasn't just some fanciful drawing. This was a record, a chronicle. The glyphs, though indecipherable, seemed to pulse with a latent energy, a silent hum that I felt more than heard. The drawings weren't random. They were deliberate. They depicted journeys, voyages between these alien star systems. And at the nexus of several of these journeys always was that symbol, the symbol of it. This book, this ancient text, was not a terrestrial artifact. The paper felt wrong, too smooth, too unnaturally preserved. The ink, a deep obsidian black, seemed to absorb the meager light. I tilted the book closer, trying to discern any identifying marks, any clue as to its origin. Nothing. It was a ghost, a relic from a time before time. The drawings became more complex, more disturbing. They showed figures, tall and gaunt, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles, interacting with various species. These beings were not benevolent explorers, and always the spiral symbol. It was a brand, a signature. One drawing in particular seized my attention. It depicted a world, a vibrant blue marble, much like Earth. It was vast, geometric, utterly alien, and at its core, glowing with an inner light, was the spiral symbol. The figures were shown descending, their forms indistinct. But their intent was clear. They were not visitors, they were harvesters. My breath caught in my throat. The scent of dust and dried plants suddenly seemed cloying, suffocating. My fingers fumbled with the clasp, my mind a chaotic whirl of impossible images. This wasn't a hypothetical. This wasn't abstract data. This was history. The ornate carvings on the mantelpiece, the patterns in the book, they were not just art. They were a language of presence, a language of dominion. Had my grandmother, this woman I never knew, somehow stumbled upon this? Had she understood? Or was she merely a custodian, a keeper of a secret too terrible to comprehend? My gaze fell upon a small, tarnished silver locket lying beside the book. I picked it up. It was cool to the touch. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, was a miniature, exquisitely rendered painting. It depicted a young woman, her eyes bright, her smile gentle, my wife. And behind her, barely visible, shimmering like heat haze, was a faint, almost imperceptible spiral. A strangled gasp escaped me. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a dream. The entity, this ancient cosmic architect, had touched my life before in ways I had never suspected. The weight of it, the sheer, crushing immensity, threatened to buckle my knees. How many others had it touched? How many worlds, and why now? Why me? What had I awoken? The air in the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited was thick with the scent of dried herbs and something else, something metallic and old. It clung to the back of my throat, a taste like pennies. I traced the carvings on the wooden table again. They weren't random, not at all. They formed a lattice, intricate and unsettling. My fingers, usually steady, trembled. The light, that weak defiance against the gloom, illuminated a specific knot in the wood. It was darker than the rest, almost black, and when I pressed into it, a faint warmth bloomed beneath my fingertip. It felt alive. A shiver, unrelated to the chill seeping from the stone walls, snaked down my spine. This was no mere farmhouse. It was a repository, a silent witness. I'd come here seeking solace, a quiet place to process the impossible data I'd unearthed. But the anomaly, a whisper in the cosmic static, had pulled me from my grief. It was a pattern, a deviation so profound it defied all known physics. It was also, I was beginning to suspect, a message. The geometric patterns on the table seemed to shift in my peripheral vision, coalescing into something more. A map, a diagram. I pulled out the worn notebook I'd brought, its pages filled with my frantic scribbles and calculations. The anomaly's signature, a complex waveform I'd christened the echo, was imprinted in my mind. I started sketching, letting my hand follow the lines in the wood, translating them onto the paper. The angles, the curves, the precise spacing of the nodes, they mirrored the spectral analysis of the echo. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was a direct transcription. The wood, aged and weathered, was a physical manifestation of something I'd only seen as ethereal data. My breath hitched. The metallic tang in the air intensified. The grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum still, seemed to tick in my mind. Each phantom beat a hammer blow. I needed context. I needed to know when. The echo had a temporal component, a subtle periodicity that I'd initially dismissed as noise. But now, looking at the intricate patterns in the wood, at the way they seemed to flow and interlock, I saw it. A sequence. A countdown. My gaze darted to the single window, its panes grimy and streaked. The sky outside was a bruised twilight. I fumbled for my tablet, the cool metal a stark contrast to the rough wood. I'd been tracking celestial events, looking for any correlation, any celestial alignment that might explain the anomaly's erratic bursts. The calendar scrolled, a list of predictable cosmic ballet. Lunar phases, planetary conjunctions, meteor showers. Nothing significant. I scrolled further, my eyes scanning for anomalies, for anything that might explain the sheer, impossible scale of the echo. Then I saw it. A notation, tucked away in a specialized section I rarely consulted. A rare, predicted event. A convergence. Not of planets, but of something far older, far more fundamental. A gravitational lensing event of unprecedented magnitude, predicted to occur within the next solar cycle. It was a phenomenon that would warp spacetime itself. bending light from distant galaxies, creating temporary, colossal structures within the fabric of the cosmos. My hands froze. The tablet slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the floor. The sound was a thunderclap in the stillness. I stared at the screen at the date highlighted in stark red. It coincided precisely with the peak intensity of the echo I'd recorded, the patterns on the table, the echo's signature, the lensing event. They were not separate. They were pieces of a single terrifying puzzle. The intelligence I'd detected, this vast, ancient entity, was not merely observing. It was orchestrating. It was using this cosmic convergence, this grand distortion of reality as a stage. A wave of nausea washed over me. The metallic taste was overwhelming now, like I'd swallowed a mouthful of rust. The air grew heavy, pressing in on me. This wasn't just data. This wasn't just a scientific curiosity. This was an invitation, or worse, a declaration of intent. The entity, whatever it was preparing. It was setting the stage for something. And Earth, I suddenly understood with a sickening certainty, was not a spectator. It was the intended audience, or perhaps something far more involved. The geometric patterns on the table seemed to pulse, a faint luminescence beneath the dust. They were a warning, a blueprint. The impending cosmic event, the convergence, was a physical manifestation of the entity's power. It could bend light, warp space. What else could it do? My eyes traced the carvings, the intricate pathways. They led to a central point, a nexus within the pattern. And at that nexus, a single, deeply etched symbol. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, a spiraling complexity that seemed to draw the eye inward, promising an infinite depth. It was filled with a growing pressure, a palpable anticipation. There was this symbol, the entity's mark, its signature. And if so, what did it signify for us, for me, for everything I thought I knew? The metallic tang in the air was stronger now, not just a taste, but a faint, acrid smell that made my eyes water. I ran my fingers over the wood grain of the table, the intricate lines of the carvings. They weren't just decorative. They were a language, a map, a warning. I recognized fragments, twisted echoes of constellations I'd studied for years but distorted as if viewed through a fractured lens. The pattern spiraled inward, a cosmic whirlpool. It spoke of presence, of immense, indifferent power, and of a hunger that stretched across impossible distances. My wife, Elena, her face, her laugh. They felt impossibly far away, a pale memory against the growing, suffocating weight of this realization. I had to tell someone, I had to. The thought was a desperate anchor in the churning sea of my thoughts. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy and numb. The signal was weak, a single bar flickering in and out. I scrolled through my contacts, past colleagues who would dismiss me as mad, past friends who would offer platitudes. There was only one person who might listen, who might understand the sheer, terrifying scope of what I'd found. I dialed the number, the ancient phone crackling with static. A gruff voice answered on the third ring. "Yes, Professor Davies, it's Thomas Ashton." My voice was hoarse, raw, a pause, then a sigh. "Thomas, it's late, and you sound like you've seen a ghost." "Worse, Professor. Much worse. I've found proof of what we talked about, the anomalies. They're not random, they're directed." The words tumbled out, a desperate cascade. I could hear the rustle of paper in the background, the clink of what sounded like a mug. "Directed, Thomas, we've been over this. Correlation doesn't equal causation. You're chasing shadows, extrapolating from noise." His tone was weary, laced with a familiar, patronizing patience. "No, you don't understand." My voice rose, cracking. I gripped the edge of the table, my grip tight. "It's a pattern, a deliberate, intelligent pattern. It's communicating or influencing, and it's looking this way. It's looking at Earth." I gestured wildly at the table, at the swirling carvings that seemed to writhe in the dim light. "Thomas, you're in that old farmhouse, aren't you? The one your grandmother left you. You said you were going there to clear your head." He was trying to be gentle, I knew, but it felt like a dismissal. "You're alone, aren't you? Alone with your grief. It plays tricks on the mind, Thomas, especially when you're staring into the void." "This isn't grief, Professor, this is real." The metallic smell seemed to intensify, filling my lungs. I coughed, a dry, hacking sound. "The data, It's not just in the deep space telescopes, it's here in this house. These carvings, they are part of it, a terrestrial echo, an anchor. Terrestrial echo, Thomas. I'm an astrophysicist, not a folklorist. And you're talking about ancient carvings in a rural farmhouse as if they are some kind of extraterrestrial Rosetta Stone. You need to come back. We can talk, properly, maybe take a break, a long one. A break, the words were a bitter taste. While that is happening, while it's reaching out, you won't listen. None of you will. I slammed my hand on the table, the wood groaning. The carving seemed to pulse with a faint, internal luminescence. A low hum, almost too faint to hear, vibrated through the floorboards. Thomas, calm down, you're agitated, come back to the university, we'll get you some rest. Rest? There's no rest, Professor, not anymore. I hung up the phone, I looked at my hands, they were trembling. The scent of dried herbs was almost completely gone, replaced by that sharp, metallic odor. It was in my clothes, on my skin. It was a scent that promised dissolution. No lights, no movement, it felt empty, as if whatever was here had already claimed it. They were not just a warning, they were an invitation, an inescapable summons. Had anyone else felt it? Had anyone else seen the true shape of the emptiness? The hum grew louder, a resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. It was not a sound. It was a pressure, a presence. It was here, and it was aware of me. The metallic tang was overwhelming now, coating my tongue, filling my sinuses. It tasted like the end of everything. What was this place truly? And why had I been led here? The air in the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited tasted like dust and forgotten promises. It clung to my tongue, a dry, gritty film. The low hum, the one that had become my constant companion, seemed to resonate from the very timbers of this old place. It vibrated in my teeth, a subtle, persistent thrumming that mimicked the frantic pulse in my own temples. I had driven for hours, the city lights receding like a bad dream, seeking a silence that this place, ironically, refused to grant. I ran a hand over the rough-hewn table, the wood cool and strangely yielding beneath my fingertips. The metallic tang was stronger here, sharp and coppery, as if a fresh wound had been opened somewhere in the walls. It made my stomach clench. I hadn't seen Sarah in months, not since the static. But the scent, that faint, acrid whisper of something not of this world, it was here. It was everywhere. The data. The impossible, beautiful, terrifying data. It had led me here, to this isolated pocket of quiet, to this decaying monument to a woman I barely knew. My grandmother. He had lived a life of simple routines, of tending to chickens and a small garden, a life utterly divorced from the cosmic horrors I had unearthed. Yet, the anomaly pointed to this precise location, this coordinates etched into the fabric of the universe like a scar. I pulled out the worn, leather-bound notebook, its pages brittle and foxed. My own frantic scribbles filled its expanse, a testament to sleepless nights and a mind stretched to its breaking point. The patterns, the equations that shouldn't exist, the signatures of something vast and ancient. It was all there. And now, the final piece of the puzzle, the location of its manifestation, was this dusty, forgotten farmhouse. I flinched, my muscles tensing. It wasn't just the wind, something felt different. The hum intensified, no longer a subtle vibration but a palpable pressure against my eardrums. I stood, my legs unsteady. The floorboards creaked, a mournful protest beneath my weight. I needed to see. I needed to understand. The anomaly wasn't just a theoretical curiosity anymore. It was here. It was now. My gaze swept across the room, searching for an anchor, a point of reference in this growing disquiet. My eyes landed on an old wooden chest tucked away in a corner, draped in a faded tapestry depicting a pastoral scene. It felt wrong, out of place. The metallic scent was strongest there, a cloying, metallic perfume. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I approached it slowly, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the rising tide of my fear. The latch was old, rusted, but it yielded with a groan. I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled amongst moth-eaten linens and yellowed photographs, was a single object. A sphere no larger than my fist, carved from a material I couldn't identify. As my fingers brushed against its surface, a jolt, not of electricity but of pure, unadulterated wrongness, shot through me. The hum reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that seemed to rip through reality itself. I could feel it pressing in, a suffocating weight. The metallic scent was overwhelming now, burning my nostrils. Panic clawed at my throat. I stumbled backward, my hand reaching for the sphere, a desperate, instinctual grab, and then it began. A ripple, not in the air but in the very light that wasn't there. Shapes that defied logic, that twisted the eye and the mind. I saw glimpses, fleeting impressions of vast, indifferent forms of cosmic entities that dwarfed galaxies, their presence an unbearable pressure. The walls of the farmhouse seemed to stretch, to warp. The familiar scent of old wood and dust was replaced by something acrid, something that smelled of ozone and decay. The hum was no longer external, it was within me, a vibration that threatened to tear my very atoms apart. I squeezed the sphere tighter, my grip tight. It was a conduit, I realized with sudden horror, a focal point. The entity wasn't just observing, it was arriving. A single, impossibly bright point of light bloomed in the center of the room, expanding with terrifying speed. It wasn't light as I knew it. It was a tear, a rent in existence. Through it I glimpsed things. Things that had no name, no form, only an unfathomable hunger. My breath hitched, ragged gasps in the suffocating pressure. I had to do something. Anything. The data, Sarah's final transmission, the patterns. They all converged on this single, terrifying moment. The sphere in my hand pulsed, a faint, internal luminescence. I felt a connection, a terrible intimacy with the unfolding chaos. What was this sphere and why here? The dust motes danced in the single shaft of weak sunlight, piercing the gloom of the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited. They swirled, tiny galaxies in a stagnant sky, and I watched them, my breath shallow. The hum, that pervasive, bone-deep thrum had lessened, or perhaps I had simply grown accustomed to its insidious presence. It was like a phantom limb, a sensation that refused to fade even after the amputation. My hands were still sticky, a cloying residue that wouldn't wash off. It smelled faintly of ozone and something else, something coppery and organic. I scrubbed them raw under the rusty tap in the small, shadowed kitchen, but the feeling persisted, a phantom touch. The water, when it finally sputtered out, was icy, a shock against my skin. It did little to clear the fog in my mind. The silence that had fallen was not a relief. It was a pregnant pause, a moment before the next terrible revelation. The grandfather clock in the hall, its pendulum stilled, stood like a sentinel guarding secrets I no longer wished to uncover. Its face, cracked and yellowed, seemed to mock me with its frozen time. Time, I was beginning to understand, was a more malleable concept than any textbook had ever suggested. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps unnervingly loud on the bare floorboards. Each creak, each groan of the old house was amplified, a symphony of decay. They shifted, I thought, just at the edge of my vision. Swirling geometries too complex to grasp that writhed like trapped insects. I blinked and they were gone, replaced by the drab, familiar print. Or was it familiar? The colors seemed off. A shade too vibrant, a hue that didn't exist in my memory of this place. My wife. Her photograph sat on the mantelpiece, a small, silver-framed rectangle. I picked it up. Her smile, once a beacon, now seemed alien. The curve of her lips, the sparkle in her eyes, they were there, but subtly wrong. As if a skilled forger had meticulously copied a masterpiece, capturing every detail but missing the soul. I traced the outline of her face with a trembling finger. Was this the same woman I had loved? The woman I had lost? The data. It was still on the laptop, humming softly on the dusty kitchen table. I had brought it with me, a fool's errand, a desperate attempt to find some anchor in the swirling chaos. The screens glowed with a faint, unnatural light, the numbers and graphs morphing, rearranging themselves into patterns that defied logic. They were speaking a language I had only begun to decipher, a language of cosmic indifference. I remembered the moment, the blinding flash, the disorienting lurch in reality. It had felt like being torn asunder and then stitched back together incorrectly. The world I had known had frayed at the edges, and now I was living in the unraveled threads. The sky outside the grimy window was a bruised purple, a color that had no place in a natural sunset. The air was thick, heavy, as if the atmosphere itself was struggling to breathe. A sound. A faint scratching coming from the attic. I froze, my heart racing a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. It was probably just a mouse, a rat, an animal seeking shelter in the forgotten spaces. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was a soft, insistent scraping like fingernails on dry wood. I looked back at the laptop. The patterns on the screen were coalescing, forming a single, overwhelming symbol, a perfect, impossible geometry. It was aware. The scratching in the attic stopped. A profound silence descended, broken only by the ragged sound of my own breathing. The purple sky outside deepened, bleeding into an inky black. The stars, when they began to appear, were not the familiar constellations. They were wrong. They were rearranged. Was this the new reality, a canvas repainted by an indifferent hand? And if so, what part did I play in this altered tapestry? The hum, that pervasive, bone-deep thrum, had lessened, or perhaps I had simply grown accustomed to its ceaseless vibration, like a phantom limb that had finally ceased to ache. The air itself felt thinner, stretched taut across the silence. I traced the worn grain of the wooden table with a fingertip, the rough texture a grounding sensation against the swirling chaos that had become my inner landscape. The data had led me here to this forgotten place, a place that felt both impossibly ancient and jarringly mundane. The old woman, the one who had sent the cryptic message, was gone, vanished like smoke in a draft. Her belongings remained, a testament to a life lived in quiet solitude. Among them, a collection of journals filled with a spidery, almost illegible script, detailing not personal anecdotes but observations. Observations of the stars, of strange patterns in the static of old radios, of the way the moonlight seemed to warp the shadows in her garden. He had seen it too, or felt it. This presence, this vast, indifferent consciousness that was slowly, meticulously reweaving existence. The cosmic anomalies weren't random, they were deliberate, adjustments, corrections. The universe was not a grand, indifferent expanse, but a meticulously crafted tapestry, and something was pulling at its threads. I had brought the core processors, the salvaged fragments of my life's work, with me. Hooked them up to the farmhouse's flickering generator, the ancient machine groaning in protest. The screens, usually a vibrant cascade of numbers and graphs, now displayed a single, unnerving image. It wasn't a star chart. It wasn't a simulation, it was a pattern, a fractal bloom of impossible geometry, pulsing with a faint internal light. It was what the old woman had described as the eye of the weaver. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The temptation to understand, to know, warred with a primal instinct for self-preservation. The data was no longer just data. It was a language spoken by something that predated stars, something that considered galaxies as mere dust motes and humanity, a fleeting anomaly. The old woman's journals spoke of a specific frequency, a resonance that, when amplified, could allow one to perceive the loom directly. Not just see the patterns, but feel the warp and weft of reality being manipulated. My hands trembled as I keyed in the sequence. The generator sputtered, the lights in the room dimmed precariously, and the hum intensified, no longer a subtle vibration but a physical pressure against my eardrums. The image on the screen began to shift. The fractal bloom expanded, its impossible angles folding in on themselves, revealing nothing and everything. It was like looking into a kaleidoscope that had been shattered and reassembled by a mad god. Colors that had no name bled into textures that defied description. Sounds, or the absence of them, pressed in. It wasn't empty space. It was the space between spaces, the raw, unformed potential from which reality was spun. And within it I saw us, not as individuals but as patterns. Fleeting configurations of energy, insignificant sparks in an infinite, deliberate construction. The old woman's scribbles flashed through my mind. It notices the loose threads. I had been a loose thread. My pursuit of the anomalous, my frantic attempts to understand the incomprehensible had drawn its attention. The data was not a discovery, it was a beacon, and I had answered its call. The image solidified, coalescing into something that was almost but not quite comprehensible. A vast, crystalline structure, impossibly intricate, spanning what felt like eternity. It was not a place, it was a process. The universe was its creation, its ongoing masterpiece. And Earth, my home, my fleeting existence, was a minor detail, a speck of dust on its cosmic canvas. A wave of profound loneliness washed over me, so potent it stole my breath. My wife, Sarah. Her face, so clear in my memory, began to shimmer, her form blurring at the edges, as if she too were a pattern susceptible to the weaver's touch. The grief, the years of agonizing emptiness, felt like a small, insignificant ache against the backdrop of this immeasurable, uncaring immensity. The generator whined, a tortured shriek. The image on the screen flickered, then resolved into a single, piercing point of light. The hum reached a crescendo, vibrating not just in my bones, but in my very soul. I felt a pull, a gentle but irresistible force drawing me towards the screen, towards that point of light. It wasn't a threat, not in the way I understood it. It was an invitation, an absorption, a reintegration into the grand design. My hand of its own accord reached out, my fingertips brushing against the cool glass of the monitor. The point of light flared, engulfing the screen, and then nothing. Just the faint, persistent hum, a lullaby for a universe being rewritten. The sunlight, now a pale ghost, had shifted. The dust motes no longer danced. They hung, suspended, as if time itself had paused. They felt solid, real, but the familiarity was a lie. The world I knew, the universe I had studied, was gone, replaced by something utterly alien, utterly vast, and utterly indifferent. I was still here in the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited, but was I still here? Or had I become something else, a thread rewoven into the loom? What happens when the weaver decides to unpick a single, insignificant knot?